It was her first day at college, and as far as Sue was concerned, the day couldn't have started worse. She had spent the past 2 hours wondering whether she had made the right decision. The butterflies in her stomach were relentless, her nerves still raw as she walked through the bustling campus of Crestwood University. The campus was huge, alive with excitement, students racing through hallways, groups chatting animatedly, and the sounds of footsteps echoing across the concrete. The vast campus seemed to swallow her whole, and as she walked into the crowded cafeteria, she immediately regretted not making a plan with anyone. She didn't have a group, didn't know a single soul. Her nerves, already frayed, now gripped her with even greater intensity. But before she could think further, a voice cut through her thoughts. "Watch out, nerd." Sue barely had time to react before a hard shoulder shoved into her, sending her tray of food flying. Her sandwich and drink splattered onto her shirt, a mess of mayo and spilled soda soaking into her jacket. She turned to face the person who had bumped into her, eyes wide, furious. It was a tall boy, with tousled dark hair and a smirk that seemed to challenge the world. His deep brown eyes met hers, but there was no apology there. He didn't even seem remotely sorry for what had just happened. His expression was one of mockery, as though he found the whole situation amusing. "Oops," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Guess you're not good at carrying your food, huh?" Sue's face burned with embarrassment, but it wasn't just the embarrassment that took hold of her. It was anger. Anger that he would treat her so carelessly, as if she was invisible or unimportant. She opened her mouth to say something, but her words failed her. The boy turned away, not even bothering to look at her as he joined a group of friends at a nearby table, laughing as though nothing had happened. Sue stood there for a moment, still in shock. The chaos of the cafeteria seemed to swirl around her as she clutched her ruined lunch tray. This wasn't how she had imagined her first day going. With a huff of frustration, she walked to the nearest trash can, disposed of her food, and made her way out of the cafeteria, fighting back tears. She hated that boy already. She hadn't even gotten his name, but she already knew she would never forget the way he had made her feel, humiliated, small, and insignificant. The next few weeks were a blur. Sue tried to focus on her studies, tried to ignore the memory of that terrible first encounter. But as fate would have it, she would run into the same boy again. His name, she learned, was Bill Kapoor. He was a junior, one of the popular guys on campus, always surrounded by his group of friends who laughed too loudly and made everyone around them uncomfortable. Every time she saw him, he was with his friends, acting as though the world belonged to him. Bill had that kind of confidence, the kind that came naturally to him, the kind that made Sue's blood boil. There were moments when their paths crossed in hallways or in class, and each time her heart would race, not from any strange attraction, but from the surge of hatred she felt for him. He was the kind of person who had everything handed to him, who acted as if people like her didn't even matter. She couldn't understand how someone could be so arrogant, so indifferent to the feelings of others. Years passed. Sue threw herself into her studies, determined to make something of herself and escape the shadow of that first encounter. Her academic record was impeccable, and she made a few close friends along the way. Bill, however, continued to be the same, a popular jock with a reputation for being a little too cocky. Every time she saw him, she could feel the sting of that first day, but she tried not to let it bother her too much. After all, he was just another face in the crowd, someone she would probably never have to deal with after graduation. But life, as it often does, has a way of throwing curveballs. It was the final semester of their college careers when Sue's life took an unexpected turn. She was invited to a formal gathering at the house of her father's old college friend. Her father had been distant lately, consumed with work, but he mentioned this event as though it were a casual affair, one of those social obligations that were just part of life. Sue, though a little reluctant, agreed to go with him. She had no idea that this seemingly mundane evening would change everything. The house was grand, a large mansion on the outskirts of town, surrounded by lush gardens and an air of old money. Sue was immediately uncomfortable. She wasn't used to these kinds of parties, filled with high-profile people she had only ever read about in newspapers. Her father, however, seemed at ease, chatting with old friends as Sue tried to blend into the background. She sipped her drink and observed the people around her until her eyes landed on a familiar face. It was Bill. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Bill stood by the fireplace, laughing with a group of people. He was dressed in a crisp suit, looking every bit the part of a well-off young man who had his life figured out. But the most shocking part was the way he was interacting with her father's friends. He was at ease, as though he had known them for years. Sue's heart pounded as she approached her father, who was deep in conversation with the host. "Dad," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Who is that?" Her father turned to look, his face softening as he followed her gaze. "Ah, that's Bill Kapoor," he said with a smile. "He's the son of one of my oldest friends, Derek. You might have heard me mention him. We went to college together." Sue was stunned. She had no idea that the arrogant boy who had made her life miserable on her first day of college was connected to her father's past. Her father continued, unaware of her shock. "Derek has been asking about you, actually. He thinks the world of you. Bill's family has been trying to set up a meeting with you. They've been eager to see how you've turned out." Sue blinked, feeling as though the ground had just shifted beneath her feet. Bill wasn't just some random jerk from college. He was tied to her father's past, and there was more. Her father smiled. "In fact, Derek wants to meet you. He's been talking about making you part of the family, possibly even as Bill's sister-in-law." Sue's breath caught in her throat. She turned to look at Bill again, her mind racing. Could it be? Was her father really suggesting that she might marry this boy, the very same one who had humiliated her on her first day at college? Before she could process this further, Bill turned and spotted her. His face lit up, and to Sue's utter disbelief, he walked over to her with a smile. "Sue, right?" he said, his voice surprisingly warm. "It's been a long time. How have you been?" Sue stood frozen, staring at him. She couldn't speak. The boy who had bullied her, who had made her life miserable, was standing in front of her now with an air of confidence and charm. He wasn't the same arrogant person she remembered from college. There was a softness in his eyes, a kind of familiarity, as if he knew her in ways she had never expected. "Bill, Sue started, but her voice faltered. What could she say? Her emotions were a whirlwind. Anger, confusion, disbelief, and something else. Something that confused her even more. Bill smiled again, as though he understood her hesitation. "I know we didn't exactly get off on the right foot back in college," he said, his voice laced with genuine sincerity. "But things are different now. I'd really like to get to know you better, Sue. We've got a lot of catching up to do." Sue stood there, her mind whirling. Was this a joke? Was this really happening? The boy who had treated her like nothing more than an annoyance was now standing in front of her, speaking as though they were long-lost friends. She had no idea what to say. It seemed that her life and the person she had once hated had just become far more complicated than she ever could have imagined. Sue stood frozen for a moment, trying to process everything that had just happened. Her father's words echoed in her ears. Bill as a possible future brother-in-law. Was this a joke? And the way Bill was speaking now? It didn't make sense. How had things changed so drastically? He had been nothing short of cruel to her back in college. How could he be standing there smiling as if they had never shared that terrible first meeting? Bill, noticing her silence, seemed to hesitate for a moment. He shifted his weight nervously, but his smile never wavered. "Look, Sue, I know this might be a lot to take in all at once, but can we just start over?" Sue blinked. Start over? Was it really that easy? Was he genuinely asking for a second chance after everything that had happened? She didn't know what to say. A part of her still remembered the hurt she'd felt when he'd shoved her on the first day of college, the humiliation, the disdain in his eyes. But another part of her couldn't help but notice how different he seemed now. The arrogance that had once been so evident was gone, replaced by a sincerity that was almost vulnerable. She took a deep breath and decided to give him a chance to explain. "You owe me an apology," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. Bill's face softened, and he nodded. "I know. And I'm sorry, Sue. I really am. I was a jerk back then. I can't even begin to explain why I acted that way. I guess I was just trying to fit in with the wrong crowd, trying to prove something to people who didn't matter. And I took it out on you, which was wrong. You didn't deserve it." Sue was silent for a moment, processing his words. Part of her wanted to hold on to the anger, to refuse to forgive him, to let the memory of his actions from the past define him forever. But another part of her understood what he was saying. She had seen so many people, including herself, make mistakes when they were younger. Mistakes they regretted and wished they could take back. "I don't know if I can just forget what happened, Bill," Sue said softly. "It hurt, and I've carried that with me for years." "I understand," he said, his tone genuine. "And I wouldn't expect you to forget. All I'm asking for is a chance to show you who I am now, who I've become. I'm not that person anymore. I was young, and I didn't know better. But I do now." Sue looked into his eyes and saw no trace of the arrogant boy who had once mocked her. Instead, she saw someone who was regretful, humble, and willing to make amends. It was strange, and it made her heart ache a little. Was it really possible for people to change? Before she could respond, her father walked over with a warm smile. "Ah, I see you two are getting acquainted. Good, good. Bill's been telling me about how much he's changed, Sue. He's not the same person he was back then. You've both grown." Sue turned to her father, still uncertain. "Dad, you really think this is a good idea?" Her father laughed softly. "I wouldn't push it if I didn't believe it. And honestly, I think you two would get along much better now than you did in college." Sue felt a mix of emotions. Her father's belief in Bill, in their potential to get along, weighed heavily on her. She glanced back at Bill, who was now standing there, his hands shoved into the pockets of his blazer. He looked nervous but hopeful, and for the first time in years, she felt like she might just be able to give him a chance. "I'll need time to think," she said finally, still unsure but wanting to give herself the space to make a decision. "But I'm open to it." Bill smiled, relief flooding his face. "I'll take that. I won't rush you. Just know I'm here, and I really want to make things right between us." Over the next few weeks, Sue and Bill spent more time together. At first it felt strange. She was still cautious around him, unsure if she could really trust him after everything that had happened in the past. But the more they talked, the more she saw the changes in him. He was no longer the arrogant boy from her college days. Instead, he was thoughtful, considerate, and most surprisingly, genuinely kind. They started to build a friendship, cautiously at first, and then something more. Bill began to open up about his past, about the pressures of living up to his father's expectations, about the insecurity that had driven him to act out, to put on a facade of confidence. He confessed how, for years, he had tried to please the wrong people, all the while pushing away the people who truly cared about him. Sue listened, and she began to understand that the boy she had hated wasn't the person he was now. He had learned, grown, and matured in ways she had never imagined. Sue, too, shared her own struggles, how she had felt isolated in college, how hard she had worked to prove herself, and how that first encounter with Bill had shaped her perception of him for so long. She spoke about her dreams and fears, her hopes for the future. Slowly, the walls between them came down. It wasn't long before Sue realized that she had forgiven Bill, not just for the incident on that first day of college, but for everything he had done in the past. He wasn't the same person, and neither was she. They had both changed, and the connection they shared now felt deeper than anything that had come before. One evening, after a particularly fun dinner with her father and Bill's family, Sue found herself walking out to the garden with Bill. The evening air was cool, and the stars above twinkled brightly in the sky. Bill stopped and turned to her, his eyes soft. "Sue," he said, taking a deep breath, "I know we've been through a lot, and I'm not expecting anything to happen overnight, but I want you to know that I care about you, more than I ever thought I would." Sue looked at him, her heart racing in her chest. It was strange, this feeling that had crept up on her over time. She had once hated him, had thought him to be nothing more than an arrogant bully. But now, standing there with him, she saw someone who had truly changed, someone who had proven himself worthy of her trust. "I care about you too, Bill," she said quietly, her voice sincere, "and I'm glad we gave this a chance." With a gentle smile, Bill reached for her hand, squeezing it softly. "So, what do you say? Can we start something new? Together?" Sue felt a smile tug at her lips. Maybe it hadn't been a coincidence after all that they had crossed paths all those years ago. Perhaps this was fate, giving them a second chance to rewrite their story. "Yes," she said softly, the word carrying more meaning than she could ever express. "Let's start fresh." And with that, their journey together began anew, this time with understanding, forgiveness, and love. What had started as a story of animosity had transformed into something beautiful, something that neither of them had expected, but both were more than ready to embrace. The boy who had once been a stranger, a source of pain and resentment, was now the man who would become an irreplaceable part of her life. And Sue had come to realize that sometimes the most unexpected connections can lead to the most beautiful endings.